The summer of 1883 had been so brutally dry that even the rattlesnakes had gone looking for shade, and Raymond Talbot stood at the cracked edge of his empty well and felt the particular kind of despair that only a proud man can feel when the land he loves turns against him. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin that told the story of 15 years working the Texas hill country. His hands were the kind that had built things: fences, barns, a reputation, and they gripped the rope hanging uselessly over the dry well shaft with a tightness that had more to do with anger than purpose. The rope just hung there. There was nothing to pull up. There had been nothing to pull up for 3 days now. The Talbot Ranch sat on 420 acres of scrub oak and limestone country southwest of Kerrville, Texas. Raymond had inherited the deed from his father, Horace Talbot, who had died of a chest fever 2 winters before, and he had spent every waking hour since trying to prove that the land was worth what the old man had believed it to be. He ran 200 head of longhorn cattle, kept a small horse remuda, and employed 2 ranch hands, a quiet Mexican cowboy named Ernesto Vega and a lanky young man from Missouri named Pete Larkin, who slept in the bunkhouse and never caused trouble worth mentioning. The drought had started in June, and by late July it had turned vicious. The creek that wound through the eastern pasture had gone from a trickle to a mud stripe to nothing at all. The water tank Raymond had constructed the previous autumn was dry as a church collection plate, and now the well itself had surrendered. He needed water. His cattle needed water. Without water, he would lose the herd. Without the herd, he would lose everything his father had built and everything he himself had staked his identity on for the better part of a decade and a half. The problem was his neighbor. Birdie Underwood owned the land directly to the north, 160 acres she had claimed under the Homestead Act 3 years prior. She was 27 years old, a widow whose husband George Underwood had died of a snake bite the very first autumn they had settled, leaving her alone with a small daughter named Clara, a pair of mules, and more stubbornness per square inch than most men Raymond had ever known. She had sunk a well that winter after George died, paid for it herself by selling the wagon and one of the mules, and through some combination of geological good fortune and sheer determination, that well had not gone dry. Raymond knew this because Ernesto had mentioned it somewhat cautiously while they were trying to coax the last of the creek mud through a cheesecloth to water the horses. "Senora Underwood's well," Ernesto had said, studying the horizon rather than looking at his employer. "I hear it is still giving water, good water." Raymond had not responded for a long moment. Then he had said, "Is that so?" in a tone that closed the subject the way a door closes firmly with the latch dropped. He was not going to ask Birdie Underwood for anything. He had made that decision some time ago, for reasons that he told himself were entirely practical, and had nothing to do with the way she had looked at him the previous spring when their fence lines crossed, and words had been exchanged about a straying bull. The bull had broken through the cedar post fence separating their properties and had wandered onto her land, where it had trampled approximately 30 feet of her kitchen garden. Birdie had come to find Raymond rather than waiting for him to come to her, which was the first thing about her that had irritated him. She had ridden up to his yard on a brown mule, not even a horse, a mule, with her dark hair pinned up under a straw hat and her blue eyes sharp and direct, and she had told him in plain language that his bull had destroyed her garden, and she expected him to do something about it. Raymond had said that he would repair the fence and replace what damage could be replaced, which he had done, but the manner in which she had arrived to tell him about it had rubbed something raw in him. She had not been afraid of him. She had not been apologetic about coming to him. She had simply expected to be treated fairly, and she had stood there waiting to see if he was going to be a reasonable man or a difficult one. He had been reasonable. He had also been deeply unsettled by the encounter in a way he could not fully explain, and unsettlement tended to manifest in Raymond Talbot as a kind of low-grade hostility. She had thanked him when the fence was repaired and the replacement seedlings were delivered, and the look in her eyes then had been something between genuine appreciation and careful assessment, as though she was still making up her mind about him. That had bothered him too. So no, he was not going to ask Birdie Underwood for water. He spent the rest of that afternoon devising alternatives. He could send Pete Larkin to Careville with the wagon and the barrel to buy water from in town, but the cost of hauling enough water to sustain 200 cattle even for a week would be ruinous, and there was no guarantee the drought would break by then. He could try to sell part of the herd now, before the cattle lost too much condition, but the market was flooded with drought-desperate ranchers doing the same thing, and the prices being offered were insulting. He could dig a second well, but that required equipment and time he did not have, and water dowsers in the county were booked 3 weeks out. He stood in his yard in the last orange light of the day and looked north, toward the line of post oak trees that marked the boundary between his land and hers. Beyond those trees, a well was giving good water. He pressed his jaw together and went inside to eat a supper of beans and salt pork that tasted exactly as grim as his mood. The next morning came up white and breathless. The sky was the color of a bleached bone, and even at 6 o'clock in the morning the heat was already pressing down like a physical weight. Raymond was in the barn checking the horses. They were gaunt and restless, beginning to show the specific dull misery of animals that do not have enough to drink, when he heard the sound of wheels on the caliche road that connected the two properties. He came out of the barn expecting Pete Larkin returning from somewhere. What he saw instead stopped him flat. Birdie Underwood was coming up his road driving a wagon. It was a good solid wagon, the one she had kept after selling the other, pulled by her remaining mule and a borrowed horse that Raymond recognized as belonging to old Martin Schwartz, who ran the feed store in town. The wagon bed was loaded with 3 large oak barrels, each one dark and wet around the seams from what was inside them. Water. She pulled the wagon to a stop in his yard with the easy competence of someone who had been handling animals and equipment alone for 3 years, and she set the brake and climbed down without waiting to be helped, which was, Raymond noted with a complicated feeling, exactly the kind of thing she would do. She was wearing a plain brown dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a wide-brimmed hat against the sun. Her dark hair was loose enough to show where it had begun to escape its pins in the heat. She had a look on her face that was entirely matter-of-fact, as though delivering 3 barrels of water to a neighbor who had not asked for any was simply an ordinary task she had attended to between breakfast and the morning's other chores. "Mrs. Underwood," Raymond said, and his voice came out flatter than he intended. "Mr. Talbot," she said pleasantly, and she walked around to the back of the wagon and began examining how best to unhook the tailgate. "I didn't send for you," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "No," she said, "you didn't. I don't need Mr. Talbot." She straightened up and faced him fully, and there was nothing aggressive in her expression, only a kind of patient directness that somehow made things worse. "I know your well has gone dry. Mine has not. I have more than Clara and I need, and your cattle are going to start dying if you don't get water into them inside the next day or 2. I brought what I could carry." She paused. "If you want to send me back home with a full wagon, that is your prerogative. But I would ask you to think about whether that particular kind of pride is something your animals can afford right now." Raymond looked at the barrels. He looked at his barn, where one of the mares had put her head over the stall gate and was staring at the barrels with enormous dark eyes. He looked at Birdie Underwood, who was watching him with exactly the steady, unafraid attention she had turned on him the previous spring, and he felt something in him that was like the sensation of having a splinter worked loose, painful and relieving at the same time. "I'll pay you for it," he said. His voice was still too rough, but it was all he had. "We'll talk about that later," she said, which was as gracious as anyone had ever been to Raymond Talbot in a situation where his pride was the obstacle. "Right now, let's get your horses watered." Ernesto appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse, took in the situation with a glance, and immediately moved to help without being asked or told, which Raymond was grateful for because it meant he did not have to issue orders in a situation where issuing orders would have felt absurd. The three of them, Birdie, Ernesto, and Raymond himself, worked together in the morning heat to get the barrels down, and the water distributed first to the horses, then to the cattle in the near pasture. Raymond watched Birdie work. She was not a tall woman, but she moved with an efficiency that made her seem capable of handling anything, and she did not complain about the heat or the weight of the buckets, or the fact that one of the longhorn steers knocked her sideways while trying to get to the water trough. She just steadied herself on the fence rail and went back to pouring. "Clara is with your neighbor, then?" Raymond asked at one point, because he felt he needed to say something that was not about pride or water or the impossible situation he was in. "She's with Mrs. Hartman. She's fond of Clara." A small smile moved across Birdie's face when she mentioned her daughter, and it transformed her expression in a way that Raymond had not expected, and found himself looking at a second longer than was strictly polite. Clara Underwood was 4 years old, Raymond knew. He had seen her a handful of times from a distance, a small, energetic child with her mother's dark hair, who had apparently inherited none of George Underwood's timid disposition. "She's a good girl," Raymond said, because it seemed like the right thing. "She is," Birdie said simply. Then, because she was apparently not a woman who spoke more words than she needed, "My well won't sustain your whole herd, but it can give enough to keep them alive while we figure out another solution." "We," Raymond said, and the word came out before he thought about it. Birdie looked at him. "Unless you'd prefer to figure it out alone," she said, and there was something very slightly amused in her voice that would have annoyed him if it had not also been entirely fair. "What did you have in mind?" he said. She set down her bucket and leaned against the fence post with her arms crossed, looking out at his cattle. "Rancher named Hooper, about 8 miles east. His land sits lower than yours and mine, and I rode out there 2 days ago. He's got a spring-fed pond that hasn't gone down more than 2 feet. He said he'd allow cattle to water there if the owner would agree to help with fence repairs on his south quarter when the drought breaks." Raymond stared at her. "You rode to Hooper's place?" "Yes. You negotiated with Hooper. I presented him with a proposal and he accepted it," she said. "Whether that is negotiation or conversation probably depends on your temperament." Raymond was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had been solving his own problems for 15 years, who had prided himself on not needing anyone, not neighbors, not family, not county commissioners who tended to overlook ranchwomen's concerns, not anyone. The idea that a woman who lived on 160 acres and pulled her own water and raised her daughter alone had thought ahead of him, had ridden to Hooper's, had arranged a solution to a problem Raymond had been treating as insoluble. It was humbling in a way that he did not know how to process in the moment. "I'll go see Hooper today," he said, "and pay for whatever arrangement you've put in place." "The arrangement only requires labor, not money," she said. "But suit yourself." Pete Larkin and Ernesto began the process of moving the first group of cattle toward Hooper's land that afternoon, a long, dusty walk that would need to be done in rotation, a portion of the herd at a time, over the coming days. Raymond rode out to Hooper's himself and found the man pleasant and straightforward, just as Birdie had apparently assessed him. The spring-fed pond was real, cool, and deep. The handshake agreement Birdie had proposed was simple and fair. Hooper, a sunburned man in his 50s with a gray beard, said, "That Underwood woman has a good head on her shoulders." "Yes," Raymond said, and found that he meant it in a way that surprised him. He rode back to his ranch in the long copper light of late afternoon and found that Birdie had gone home. She had not stayed for supper or waited for thanks or done anything that might have obligated him further. She had simply come, done what needed doing, arranged what needed arranging, and left. The empty barrels were stacked neatly beside his barn. There was a folded piece of paper tucked under a stone on his porch step. He unfolded it. Her handwriting was small and careful. "Mr. Talbot, My well can spare approximately 40 gallons per day above what Clara and I require. You are welcome to it for as long as the drought continues. I ask nothing for it except that if you have any knowledge of what ails the peach trees on my eastern fence line, I would welcome your thoughts. B. Underwood. Raymond read the note twice. Then he sat down on his porch step and read it a third time, and the thing that moved through him then was not exactly gratitude, though it was in that neighborhood. It was more like the feeling of looking up and realizing the sky was bigger than you had remembered. He slept badly that night, which was unusual for him. He was a man who had always slept with the dense, dreamless efficiency of someone who worked hard enough that his body had nothing left for complications. But he lay in the hot dark of his bedroom and thought about peach trees, which was absurd, and about the way Birdie Underwood had set down her bucket and leaned against that fence post, and about how she had said, "we," with such uncomplicated naturalness, as though it had not occurred to her that they were, in any important sense, strangers. He got up at 4:30, when the stars were still thick overhead, and went a look at her peach trees. He brought a lantern and walked the fence line north in the gray pre-dawn, letting himself through the gate that connected their properties. A simple wire gate he had installed himself 2 years ago for no particular reason he could now name. He found her peach trees easily. There were 8 of them planted along her eastern fence, and even in the poor light he could see the trouble. The leaves on 3 of the trees were yellowing from the margins inward, and on 2 of the others the bark showed the distinctive scale deposits that he recognized as a particular variety of bark louse that spread rapidly in dry conditions. He walked the trees in the growing light, and when the sun had come up enough to see clearly he went back to his ranch, got his horse, and rode to Martin Schwartz's store in town to buy sulfur powder and a brush applicator. He was back on her fence line by 9 o'clock in the morning. Birdie found him there at 9:10, when she came out to do her morning chores and spotted a man crouched at the base of her 3rd peach tree with a brush in his hand. She stopped in her tracks and stared. "Mr. Talbot," she said. He looked up. He was covered in fine yellow sulfur dust and the sun was already punishing overhead, and he was aware that his entrance to this scene was not exactly dignified. "Bark lice," he said. "The yellowing is iron deficiency from the drought stress, but the more pressing issue is the lice. If they're not treated, they'll spread to all 8 trees before the month is out." Birdie was quiet for a moment. "I see," she said. "I'll need to treat all of them," he said. "You don't have to stay, it'll take an hour." She did not go inside. She stood and watched him work, and after a little while she said, "Would you like some water?" And the small irony of that particular offer was not lost on either of them, because there was a half-beat pause before she added, "And coffee. I have coffee." Coffee would be welcome, he said, which was the closest Raymond Talbot had come to accepting help with any degree of grace in a very long time. She brought it out to him in a blue enamel mug, and when he straightened up to drink it he found her crouched beside the tree he had been treating, examining the bark with the same careful attention she had given everything else. Her hat was on the ground beside her, and her dark hair caught the morning light in a way that he noticed and immediately decided not to continue noticing. "You know about peach trees," she said. "My mother kept an orchard," he said. 12 trees. She was particular about them." "Where was that?" "East Texas, near Nacogdoches." She looked up at him. "You're a long way from there." "My father moved west when I was 16. He was always certain that the next piece of ground would be better than the last one. He took a drink of coffee. It was good coffee, strong and not bitter. The hill country was as far as he got. Birdie was quiet, turning a yellowed peach leaf in her fingers. "George was from Missouri," she said after a moment. "He was certain, too, about the Homestead Act, about Texas, about all of it." She set the leaf down carefully. "He was right about the land, at least. It's good land." "It is," Raymond said, and he meant his own land and hers and the whole difficult, beautiful, waterless stretch of hill country that had claimed them both. He finished treating the trees and packed up the sulfur and the brush, and Birdie offered him dinner. It was closer to noon by then than he had realized, and he was about to refuse, because refusing was a muscle he kept in very good condition, But then Clara came running out of the house and stopped dead when she saw him, with the theatrical alertness of a 4-year-old who has discovered something requiring immediate investigation. "Who are you?" Clara demanded. "I'm your neighbor," Raymond said. Clara considered this. She had her mother's eyes exactly that same direct, serious blue, but on a 4-year-old face the effect was more disarming than intimidating. "Do you have any animals?" she asked. 200 head of cattle," he said, "and 6 horses." Clara's eyes went enormous. "6," she breathed as though he had said 600. "Clara," Birdie said, "come in and wash your hands for dinner." "Can he eat with us?" Raymond looked at Birdie. Birdie looked at Raymond with an expression that was carefully neutral except for something in the corner of her mouth that might have been laughter trying not to happen. "If he'd like to," Birdie said. He ate dinner with them. It was a simple meal, cornbread and beans, and some salt-cured ham that Birdie served with a quiet economy that made it clear she did not waste food or anything else. Clara sat across from Raymond and interrogated him with systematic thoroughness about each of his 6 horses. Their names, their colors, their dispositions, whether any of them had ever bucked anyone off. And Raymond answered each question with a seriousness that matched hers, because it was obvious that Clara Underwood required genuine engagement and would accept nothing less. "This one," Raymond said, taking a small folding knife from his vest pocket and unfolding it to show Clara a carved horse head he had made from a scrap of cedar some months ago and had been carrying around intending to give to nobody in particular, "was my first horse here in the hill country. His name was Captain." Clara took the carved horse with enormous reverence. She turned it in her small hands, studying it from every angle. "You can keep it if you want," Raymond said. Birdie looked at him across the table. The expression on her face was something he could not quite categorize, soft and careful, and something else underneath that he did not look at directly. "Say thank you," Birdie said to Clara gently. "Thank you," Clara said, already fully absorbed in the carved horse. Raymond rode home that afternoon with the strange sensation that something in the geography of his life had shifted slightly. The way land shifts in heavy rain imperceptibly at first, and then all at once. The drought continued through August, relentless and personal, as droughts in the Texas hill country always felt, as though the sky had taken a specific dislike to everything growing beneath it. Raymond made good on his agreement to send cattle to Hooper's Pond in rotation, and he filled his water barrels daily from Birdie's well, and he paid for this in a currency that had nothing to do with money. He repaired her wagon wheel when the hub cracked. He rebuilt the section of her fence the drought-crazed longhorn steer had broken through again. He brought her a salt block when she was short, and he helped her bring in the hay she had managed to cut from the east meadow before it dried to nothing. None of these things were discussed as transactions. They happened because they needed happening, and because somewhere between the empty well and the peach trees and the dinner at her table, the idea of Birdie Underwood as a stranger had become impossible to maintain. He began stopping at her fence line on his morning ride. Not every morning, some mornings he had too much to do, or told himself he did, but enough that it became a thing that happened, a pattern that both of them acknowledged and neither of them named. She would come out onto her porch with her coffee, and he would sit his horse, and they would talk about the state of the land, the cattle, the weather, Clara's most recent scheme, the politics of the county, the price of beef on the hoof, the news from the Kerrville paper when either of them had gotten into town. They talked about Nacogdoches and Missouri. They talked about Horace Talbot's conviction that the hill country was the finest land in Texas, and George Underwood's conviction that a man who worked hard enough could not fail. They talked about the ways fathers and husbands could be right about some things and completely wrong about others. One morning in late August, Birdie came out to the fence line instead of waiting on the porch. She was walking fast, which was unusual enough to put Raymond on alert before he had even pulled his horse up. "Something's happened," he said. "2 men came through last night," she said. "I heard them at the well. I stayed inside with Clara until they left, but this morning I found the bucket was taken and there was sign they'd camped in the east pasture." Raymond felt something tighten in his chest that was not merely neighborly concern. "Did they approach the house?" "No, they moved on before first light, I think." She was holding herself with the careful composure of a woman who had been frightened and was now on the other side of it, dealing with the practical aftermath. "I wanted to tell you in case they came your way. I also found where they'd helped themselves to about 20 gallons of water before they left. I'll ride east and see if I can find sign of them," Raymond said. "Raymond," she said, and then stopped, because it was the first time she had used his first name, and they both heard it land between them. He waited. "Be careful," she said. "I don't know who they were or what they were looking for." "I'll be careful," he said. He did not find the men. They had moved off the Underwood land and east onto the open range, where their tracks mixed with cattle and deer and became impossible to follow. He rode back around midday with nothing to report except that they appeared to be gone, and he went to her house to tell her so. Clara was in the yard with a stick drawing elaborate pictures in the dust, and she looked up and said "Raymond" when she saw him, which was also a first and which hit him somewhere between the ribs in an unexpected way. He told Birdie what he had found. They stood on her porch and looked east, and he said, "I'm going to ask Pete Larkin to ride your fence line morning and evening for a while. Just until things settle." Birdie turned to look at him. "You don't need to do that," she said, but the way she said it was different from the way she said things that she genuinely meant to be refused. It was more like the way a person says something they want to be argued out of. "I know I don't need to," he said. "I'm going to anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, that measuring look she had, and something in it had changed from the first time he had been on the receiving end of it. The assessment was still there, but something else had joined it, something warmer, something less provisional. "Thank you," she said. "Pete won't mind," Raymond said, which was true but also not what she was thanking him for, and both of them knew it. Pete Larkin was, in fact, entirely delighted with this new assignment, because Pete was 19 years old and had been quietly in admiration of Mrs. Underwood's general composure since the day he had first seen her coaxing her mule through a mud patch, with the patient expertise of a woman who had learned that patience was often more useful than force. He rode her fence line with a diligence that would have satisfied a cavalry sergeant. The strangers did not come back. In September, with the drought beginning to ease, a series of slow soaking rains moved through the hill country, not dramatic enough to cause flood but generous enough to begin the work of recovery. Raymond found himself facing a different kind of problem than the ones he was accustomed to solving. He was falling in love with Birdie Underwood. He discovered this one evening when he was eating alone in his kitchen, which he had been doing since his father died, and which had never particularly bothered him. And he realized that the thing he had been looking forward to all day was not supper, but the conversation he'd had at the fence line that morning. A 20-minute discussion about whether it was worth planting winter rye in a drought year that had extended into genuinely interesting territory about soil composition, and the reading habits of a cattle rancher from the border country, whom Birdie had met at the Schwartz store, who had apparently recommended a treatise on dryland farming that she had then ordered and was waiting to arrive. He had thought about that conversation at intervals throughout the day, the way a man thinks about a song that has gotten into his head, returning to it, running it over, finding new things in it. He had thought about the way she tilted her head when she was making a point she was uncertain of. He had thought about her hands moving on the fence rail. He had thought about Clara saying his name in the yard. He set down his fork and looked at the wall of his kitchen for a while. Then he got up and went to wash his hands and face with the focused deliberateness of a man who intends to think clearly about something important. And when he had dried his face and looked at himself in the small tin mirror above the wash basin, what he saw was a man who had been alone for long enough that he had started to confuse solitude with sufficiency. He went to bed thinking about Birdie Underwood and lay there in the cooling dark, as the first real autumn wind moved through the post oaks outside his window, and he thought about what it would mean to feel this way about a woman who was also his neighbor, who was also a widow, who was also the mother of a 4-year-old girl who had taken his carved horse and said his name in her small, serious voice. And he thought, "This is either the best or the worst idea I have ever had, and I am going to be very foolish about it either way." He was not a man who understood sentiment particularly well. His father had been a practical, unsentimental man, and Raymond had been formed largely in that mold: work, responsibility, the land, and not much time given over to the softer categories of experience. His mother had died when he was 17, and he had grieved her in the only way he knew, which was to work harder and say less, and the grief had eventually settled into a quiet ache that he had carried so long it had become just part of his weight. He had never courted anyone seriously, because the ranching life in the hill country did not present many opportunities, and because he had been too busy, and because, if he was honest, he had not met anyone who seemed to him worth the vulnerability of it. The problem with Birdie Underwood was that she had made herself worth the vulnerability before he had thought to guard against it. She had done it by being exactly herself: competent, direct, unafraid, generous in the specific way that made it seem like generosity was simply what she considered the minimum. And by the time he understood what had happened, it was already past the point where he could walk it back. October arrived cool and rinsed clean, the way Texas hill country sometimes was after a hard summer, as though the land itself was relieved. The creek that had gone dry came back as a thin, clear thread. The cattle came in from Hooper's looking better than they had any right to, given the summer. Raymond spent 3 long days on Hooper's fence repairs, as promised, and brought Pete and Ernesto to help, and they got through it in good time. He came back from Hooper's on the 3rd afternoon to find a covered dish on his porch. The cloth over it was a faded yellow calico he recognized as a scrap from a curtain he had seen in Birdie's kitchen. Underneath was a peach pie made from the orchard he had saved. There was a note tucked under the dish: "The trees are doing beautifully. Clara picked these herself. B. Underwood." Raymond sat down on his porch step with the pie and the note and the long gold light of the October afternoon, and he thought that he was absolutely going to say something to Birdie Underwood the next time he saw her. And he was also terrified, which was a new sensation for a man who had ridden through flash floods and doctored cattle through screwworm and buried his father in frozen ground and never once been terrified. He ate the pie, and it was excellent. He was going to tell her it was excellent. He was going to tell her other things too. The opportunity came 4 days later, not at the fence line but at the Schwartz store in town, which they had both arrived at separately on the same morning for separate errands that turned out to bring them to the same counter at the same time. Clara was not with Birdie. She had left her with Mrs. Hartman again, and Raymond was alone, and the store was otherwise empty, and Martin Schwartz was in the back looking for a particular set of hinges that Raymond had ordered 2 weeks ago. Birdie was buying coffee and a length of blue fabric for something she did not name, and Raymond was waiting for his hinges, and they stood in the quiet store and talked in the easy, natural way they had developed over the months of fence lines and drought and peach trees. And then Martin Schwartz's extended search for the hinges went on long enough that a silence fell between them that was different from their ordinary silences. Warmer, a little uncertain. Like the silence before something is said that cannot be taken back, Raymond looked at Birdie. She was looking at the length of blue fabric on the counter, and her hands were still, and he could see from the slight set of her jaw that she was aware of the silence too. "That pie was the finest thing I have eaten in longer than I care to admit," he said. She looked up. "Clara was very proud of the peaches," she said. "I ate the whole thing," he said. "I don't say that to embarrass you. I just want to be accurate about it." A smile moved across her face, not the careful, controlled expression he had seen her deploy in practical situations, but a real smile, quick and warm, and it hit him the same way Clara saying his name had hit him. "She'll want to know that," Birdie said. "Tell her she's a better peach picker than anyone I know," he said. Then, because the silence was going to come back and he was not going to waste it, "I'd like to come to supper on Saturday if you'll have me, to thank you properly, for the pie and for the water, and the summer, and all of it." She watched him for a moment, that measuring look, but there was no wariness in it now, only that careful warmth that he had been watching develop all through the summer like a plant that was not going to be hurried. "Saturday supper," she said. "Yes, come at 6. Martin Schwartz found the hinges at that moment, bustling back with them, and a great deal of apology for the delay. And the conversation shifted to the practical, and Raymond paid for his hinges and Birdie paid for her coffee and fabric, and they went out into the October morning, and said goodbye with the ordinary pleasantness of neighbors, and Raymond rode home feeling as though something fundamental in the world had arranged itself into a more correct configuration. He spent an embarrassing amount of time on Saturday considering what to wear, which was absurd because he owned exactly 3 sets of clothes worth considering, and his everyday work clothes were not among the contenders. He put on his good shirt, which was dark blue and had been pressed sometime in recent memory, and his cleaner pair of trousers, and he brushed his hat and polished his boots and then looked at himself and thought, "This is what you are, Raymond Talbot, and she has seen you covered in sulfur dust and covered in creek mud and covered in fence-post dirt, and she invited you to supper anyway, so perhaps stop deliberating." He arrived at 6 o'clock with a bottle of sarsaparilla from Martin Schwartz's store. It was not wine, which seemed too assuming, and it was not nothing, which seemed too careless, and Clara opened the door before he had knocked, which meant she had been watching for him, which made something in his chest do a thing he chose not to analyze. "You're here," Clara announced, as though this was the resolution of a suspense that had been building all day. "I am," he said. "Here." He produced from his coat pocket a small carved rabbit he had made the previous evening, because he had remembered how carefully she had held the carved horse, and because it had given his hands something useful to do while his mind was occupied with things that could not be carved out of cedar. Clara received the rabbit with the same reverence as the horse. She went immediately to find the horse so the 2 carvings could be formally introduced to each other, and Raymond stepped inside. Birdie's house was small and neat and smelled of wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of the peach preserves she had put up in August. There were curtains at the windows, the blue calico, not yet cut down to size but draped over the rod in a temporary way that suggested it was in progress, and a braided rug that was old but well kept, and a table set for 3 with a care that Raymond found unexpectedly moving. She had put wildflowers in a jar, some kind of late-season bloom, purple-headed and small, and the sight of that small, deliberate gesture of beauty in the middle of a practical working life hit him somewhere behind the sternum. "Mr. Talbot," Birdie said from the kitchen doorway, untying her apron. "Raymond," he said, "if that's all right." She looked at him for a moment. "Raymond," she said, and the way she said it was different from the way Clara said it, quieter, more considered, carrying something that he wanted to hear again. "And you're Birdie," he said. "You have been for a while now in my thinking, so I thought I should say it out loud." Something moved across her face at that, a swift, unguarded softness that she did not quite manage to compose before he saw it. "Sit down," she said. "Everything is almost ready." Supper was roasted chicken with root vegetables that she had grown in the kitchen garden. The rebuilt garden, replanted after his bull had dismantled the first one, and fresh bread, and the last of a jar of honey. Clara ate with the concentrated efficiency of a child who has been told she must be on good behavior but who cannot entirely suppress her natural inclination to ask questions. And so questions were asked, but in a slightly more orderly fashion than Raymond had come to expect. He and Birdie talked as they ate about the autumn, about what the winter might bring, about whether the drought had broken for good or merely paused, about Ernesto's family down in the border country and Pete Larkin's mother who sent him letters that he read so many times the paper went soft at the folds, about the book on dryland farming that had finally arrived, and which Birdie had found fascinating, and which Raymond borrowed at her offer, tucking it under his arm when he said good night. After Clara had gone to bed, a production that involved the carved horse and the carved rabbit being properly settled in their sleeping arrangements before Clara herself could be settled, Birdie made coffee and they sat on the porch in the cool October night, and the stars were extraordinary, the way they always were this far from town, thick and present overhead. "I owe you an apology," Raymond said. Birdie looked at him, waiting. "When you came with the water barrels," he said, "I was not gracious about it. I was trying to refuse something I needed and couldn't afford to refuse, and I took that out on you in small ways that you didn't deserve." "You weren't terrible," she said. "You were proud. It's not the same thing." "It can be. Sometimes," she allowed, "but you treated the trees and you sorted out the arrangement with Hooper and you sent Pete to ride the fence, so I think your pride found its place eventually." He looked at her. She was looking at the stars, her coffee cup held in both hands, and the night was very quiet around them except for the sound of the creek running again in the distance. "Birdie," he said. She turned to look at him. In the dim light of the lamp through the window her face was soft and serious and achingly familiar, because he had spent months learning it by increments, by watching it in morning light at the fence line and afternoon light over a water trough and the warm light of this kitchen. And he knew the exact quality of her attention and the precise shape of her smile, and the way she pressed her lips together when she was thinking. "I find myself wanting to come to supper more than once," he said. "Not as a neighbor thanking another neighbor, as something else. And I want to say that plainly because I think you deserve plainness from me more than you deserve me trying to work up to it in a way that is comfortable for me." The silence stretched out for a moment. The creek ran. The stars held their positions. Birdie Underwood looked at Raymond Talbot with those steady blue eyes, and he sat with the discomfort of having said an honest thing and waiting for an honest response. "I think I would like that," she said, carefully, as though placing each word with deliberation. "Though I want to be plain, too. I have Clara, and this land, and I have not. It has been 3 years since George, and I have not. This is not something I will enter lightly." "I would not want you to enter it lightly," he said. "I am not a man given to lightness in most things, and this is not one of the exceptions." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded once with the decisive solemnity of someone making a decision they have been considering for longer than the conversation. "Come to supper next Saturday as well," she said. "We'll see how we manage." He rode home through the star-thick night with the book on dry land farming, and the extraordinary sensation of being a man who has been in darkness for so long that he had stopped remembering that light was an option. The autumn moved forward and Raymond came to supper on Saturdays, and then on Wednesdays as well, and then it became a natural and unremarkable thing for him to be at her table on both days, and then on other days when some particular reason, a fence repair, a question about the cattle, a chapter from the dry land farming book that required discussion, provided an excuse that both of them understood was partly an excuse and partly not. Clara became his most enthusiastic partisan. She showed him the accumulated society of carved animals he had made her. There were now 7 of them, because he found he could not go to supper without bringing one, and the act of carving them in the evenings had given the long, quiet nights of a solitary man a warmth they had not previously had. She informed him gravely that the horse and the rabbit were friends, but the rabbit was more serious of temperament, and asked him if he could make a dog next, and then specified a particular kind of dog, spotted, with big ears, which Raymond found required considerable creative interpretation, but produced a result that satisfied Clara's specific requirements. He was very careful with her. He understood that she was 4 years old, and that she had not had a father in her memory in any meaningful sense, and he did not want to press himself into a role she had not asked for, or give her affection that might later be complicated by events he could not predict. But he found that the carefulness was less necessary than he had feared, because Clara was also very clear about what she wanted, which was apparently to have Raymond at supper as often as possible, and to be taught, on weekend mornings, how to whistle. Birdie watched him with Clara with that careful attention she had for everything, and he saw in her face during those watching moments something that moved in him like deep water, slow and powerful, and immensely important. In November, on a day when a cold front had pushed through, and the sky was the particular brilliant blue of Texas in November, Raymond was at her fence line in the morning, still on horseback. But they had long since moved past the formality of that mattering, and Birdie came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat on the top fence rail with a comfort that suggested she had done this before. And they sat together in the cold, clear morning, and Raymond said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "Ask. I want you to consider whether you would be willing to marry me." He said it straight, because she had told him she valued plainness, and because he had learned enough about himself in the past months to know that circling was not going to make it easier. I know it's not a small thing, and I know you said you would not enter anything lightly, and I am not asking you to answer immediately. I'm asking you to consider it." Birdie was very still for a moment. The cold wind moved through the post oaks and rattled the dry leaves, and the creek murmured somewhere beyond them. "Why?" she said. He looked at her. "Because I want you, not just on Saturdays and Wednesdays and whatever other reasons I can manufacture, every day. Because your land and mine adjoin and they would be better together. And I know that's a practical reason, but I am a practical man, and I want the practical reasons to be real and honest, not just convenient. And because Clara calls me by my first name and brings me things to look at, and I think about her when I'm not there. And that is something I did not expect, and which I now can't imagine undoing. And because you are the best person I have encountered in 15 years in this country, and I would like to stop being alone in the particular way I have been alone, and I think you might be feeling some version of the same thing, or I would not be saying any of this." Birdie set her coffee cup on the fence post. She looked at him with the expression he knew best, that careful, measuring, warm attention, and then she said, "I have been feeling some version of the same thing." She paused. "I want to think about it. Not because I am uncertain of you. I am more certain of you than I have been of anything in a long while. But because Clara is part of this, and I need to think about what is right for her, and because I want to say yes and mean it entirely." "Take whatever time you need," he said. She looked at him. "Give me 2 weeks." She gave him 10 days. He spent those 10 days doing what he had always done, working the land, tending the cattle, keeping the machinery of the ranch operational, but with the specific alertness of a man who is waiting for something that will change everything. He was not anxious, exactly. He had said what was true, and she had said what was true, and the rest was hers to determine, and he trusted her determination the way he trusted good fences and sound cattle, completely, based on evidence. On the 10th morning he came to the fence line, and she was already there, waiting, with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and that expression on her face that was decided and clear. "Yes," she said before he had even pulled his horse up. He sat his horse and looked at her and felt something open in his chest like a window. "Yes," she said again, steady and certain. "I have talked to Clara. I know she is 4 years old and that she does not fully understand what it means, but I wanted her to know, and I wanted to see how she received it. She asked if you would be at every supper. I said yes. She said that was a very good idea." Birdie's voice did something at that, a slight catch that she smoothed over, but he heard it. "And I think it is a very good idea, too." He dismounted in a single movement and stood on the other side of the fence from her, and neither of them moved for a moment. And then she opened the wire gate between their properties. The gate he had put up 2 years ago, and had never been able to explain the reason for until now, and he stepped through it. He kissed her, there between the post oaks with the cold November morning around them, and she kissed him back with a directness and a warmth that were exactly what he would have predicted, and also nothing like anything he had prepared for. And when they stepped apart, she was looking at him with those blue eyes very bright and a color in her face that the cold morning could not fully account for. "We should tell Clara in person," she said. "She'll want specifics." What kind of specifics? Whether the horses will come to this property, whether she can help feed them. Birdie's mouth curved. She has a list. Raymond laughed a real laugh, which surprised him a little because it had been a while since laughter had come that easily. All right, he said. Let's go hear the list. They were married in December in the small Lutheran church in Careville, with Ernesto and Pete as witnesses, and Mrs. Hartman weeping generously in the first pew, and Clara in a new dress that Birdie had made from the blue calico fabric that had been waiting on the curtain rod all autumn. The preacher was a compact man named Reverend Fish, who had married dozens of couples in that church, and who recognized, from long experience, the particular quality of attention with which Raymond Talbot watched Birdie Underwood when she walked toward him, not with the stunned wonder of a man overwhelmed, but with the focused, grateful recognition of a man who has found the exact thing he had stopped believing he would find. They spoke their vows with a simplicity and sincerity that made Mrs. Hartman weep harder. Clara held the carved horse and the carved rabbit through the entire ceremony, and at the conclusion announced to the assembled guests, who numbered approximately 12, that Raymond was now her father and was going to teach her to whistle, which Raymond confirmed with all due solemnity. They combined the properties in the practical sense immediately. Raymond moved his operations to accommodate Birdie's land, which he now considered equal to his own rather than adjacent to it, and the fence between their properties was taken down in its entirety, replaced by a combined operation that was larger and more resilient than either had been separately. The access to Birdie's well had been what kept his cattle alive through the drought, and now the well served the whole operation without the complexity of negotiation. The winter was cold and quiet, and the best Raymond had ever spent. He learned the rhythms of a house that contained other people, the particular sound of Clara waking up in the morning and running to see if there was frost on the window, the way Birdie moved through the kitchen in the dark before dawn, the small domestic negotiations of lives that were genuinely different being lived in genuine proximity. He was not always graceful about it. There were moments when the solitude he had been living for so long pressed back against the new closeness, in ways he had to consciously work through moments when he needed the barn or the open pasture the way a man needs air. But Birdie understood this without him having to explain it, which was one of the consistent small miracles of being married to a person who was genuinely perceptive. She was perceptive about her own needs too. She had been running her 160 acres alone for 3 years, and she had her own deep habit of self-sufficiency. And there were things she wanted to do her own way that had nothing to do with doubting his judgment, and everything to do with the legitimate expertise she had developed in her own work. They argued sometimes about land management, about cattle decisions, about whether the north pasture should be rested next season or the east. The arguments were not angry mostly, because they had both by that point a genuine respect for the other's reasoning, but they were real arguments between two people with opinions, and Raymond found them satisfying in a way that he would not have predicted, because they always resolved, and the resolving was interesting. He whistled with Clara on Saturday mornings when the chores were done. She was a determined student, and had achieved a thin, wavering tone by February that she was inordinately proud of. He taught her to recognize the tracks of the animals in the snow when snow fell in January: white-tailed deer, wild turkey, the delicate cross-stitch of field mice, the broad-clawed signature of an armadillo. She took this information with the same serious attention she brought to everything, and cataloged it in her memory with an efficiency that reminded him powerfully of her mother. Spring came and the creek ran full, and the land came back from the drought with that particular exuberance of land that has been very thirsty, the grasses thick and green, the wildflowers unreasonable in their abundance, the peach trees flowering with a density of white blossom that made Birdie stop in the middle of her morning chores and just look at them. Raymond came up behind her in the orchard, and she was standing among the white flowering trees with her hands loose at her sides and her face tilted up, and she looked so completely herself, so exactly right in this place, that he had to simply stand there for a moment before he could say anything. "It's a good year for them," he said. "The sulfur treatment held," she said. "Look at them." He looked. 8 trees in full blossom, filling the morning with the sweetness of it. "They're fine trees," he said. She turned around and saw whatever was on his face, and her expression shifted into that warmth he knew best. She stepped toward him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the peach orchard in the spring morning with the blossoms falling around them in the light wind. And Raymond Talbot, who had stood at an empty well and felt the specific despair of a proud man watching his land fail him, felt instead something that was the precise opposite of that: a fullness, a sufficiency, a sense that the world had arranged itself around a rightness it had been moving toward all along. Birdie said quietly, her face against his shoulder, "I have something to tell you." He waited. "We're going to have a baby," she said. The peach blossoms fell. The spring wind moved through the orchard. Raymond held his wife in the morning light and let that information move through him the way the rains had moved through the drought-cracked earth, slowly at first, and then all at once, reaching everything. "When?" he said. "September, I think. Mrs. Hartman agrees." He held her tighter and said nothing for a while, because the things that were moving in him were real and large, and he did not want to reduce them to inadequate words. Then he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm fine," she said. "A little tired in the mornings. Nothing I can't manage." "You're going to let me manage some of it with you," he said. She lifted her face and looked at him. "Raymond," she said, with a fondness so clear it was almost amused. "I mean it," he said, equally. "I know you mean it," she said. "That is why I am not arguing with you about it." Clara received the news of the baby's coming with characteristic seriousness. She asked several precise questions about the logistics of the situation, and when those were answered, she said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" And when Birdie said they did not know yet, Clara said, "I hope it is a boy. I already have Mrs. Hartman and you and Raymond. We have enough girls." This logic was accepted by the assembled adults as sound. Summer came and the land was generous, nothing like the punishment of the previous year. Raymond expanded the cattle operation, added 20 head, sold well at the fall market, and repaired Hooper's fence on schedule. A matter he treated as a point of personal honor, and Hooper had by then become something approaching a friend, the kind of relationship that forms between men who have dealt with each other fairly over hard country. Ernesto brought his mother from the border country to visit in July. A small, sharp-eyed woman who assessed Birdie with thorough attention on the first afternoon, and then on the second afternoon sat in Birdie's kitchen and taught her 3 recipes that she said were the only ones worth knowing, which Birdie received with complete sincerity and Ernesto received with a kind of amazed relief. As though he had been uncertain his mother would approve of anything, and was gratified by the discovery that she approved of quite a lot. Pete Larkin turned 20 in August and wrote his mother in Missouri a letter that apparently contained several paragraphs about the Talbot Ranch that his mother then wrote back about at length, expressing opinions about the suitability of Texas as a permanent home and the advisability of marriage in terms that Pete shared with Raymond in a state of mild desperation. Raymond told him, with the particular authority of a man who had recently resolved exactly these questions in his own life, that his mother's opinions about the suitability of Texas would not ultimately be the deciding factor in his future, and that the questions of marriage were best approached without overthinking. Pete said, "Is that how you did it?" Raymond considered. "No," he said. "I overthought it entirely, but I am recommending you do it better than I did." In September, on a Wednesday morning when the summer heat had finally begun to soften and the post oaks were showing the first whisper of turning, Birdie gave birth to a son. He arrived with the focused, purposeful energy that Raymond would later identify as a consistent personality trait, and he announced himself immediately and with conviction. Raymond sat in the bedroom of the house that had been Birdie's and that was now theirs. He had been there for all of it, because Birdie had not asked him to leave and he had not offered to go, and Mrs. Hartman had been there too, practical and steady, and weeping appropriately at the end, and held his son in his arms with the careful deliberateness of a man who has handled many fragile and valuable things in his life, and understands that none of them were quite like this. Clara came in from Mrs. Hartman's when it was done, and she stood beside the bed and looked at her mother and the baby with the expression of someone who has been informed that a situation is coming and is now taking its measure. "He is very small," she said. "He'll grow," Raymond said. "He does not look like either of you," Clara said, with the merciless accuracy of a 5-year-old. "He looks like himself," Birdie said from the bed, with the exhausted certainty of a woman who has just done an enormous thing and knows her own mind. Clara considered this. Then she reached out one careful finger and touched the baby's hand, and the baby's fingers wrapped around her finger with the blind, instinctive grip of the newly arrived, and Clara's face changed in a way that Raymond would remember for the rest of his life, all the seriousness and assessment dropping away for one unguarded moment into pure, uncomplicated tenderness. "Hello," Clara said very quietly to the baby. "I am your sister. I will teach you to whistle." Raymond looked at Birdie. Birdie looked at Raymond. The October light came through the window and lay across the bed and the baby and the careful joining of their lives, and something was entirely complete. They named the boy James Horace Talbot James for no particular reason except that it suited him, and Horace for Raymond's father, who had moved west with such certainty that the next piece of ground would be better, and who had, in the end, been right, though not in any of the ways he had foreseen. The boy grew with the steady determination of a child who has decided to be substantial, and he was substantial broad through the chest like his father by the time he was 2, with his mother's dark hair and eyes that shifted between blue and gray depending on the light. He walked at 10 months and spoke at 13 months, and thereafter did not stop speaking, which delighted Clara and bemused Raymond and charmed Birdie absolutely. By the following spring, with James pulling himself up on the porch railing and Clara industriously attempting to teach him the rudiments of whistling theory, the Talbot operation had grown to 540 acres and 280 head of cattle, with the horse remuda expanded to 12, and a small kitchen garden that had become, under Birdie's management, a serious and productive enterprise rather than the modest survival measure it had been. She sold preserves and dried herbs to Martin Schwartz's store and used the money to buy 2 more fruit trees, a plum and an apple, which she planted with the methodical optimism of a woman who thinks in seasons. Raymond watched her plant them one afternoon in early spring, on her knees in the dark turned earth with the light behind her and James sitting in the grass nearby, examining an earthworm with the concentrated interest of a scientist confronting an important specimen. And he thought about the summer he had stood at an empty well and felt that particular despair, the despair of a proud man watching something he had built begin to fail, and about how completely he had misunderstood what the empty well meant. It had not meant failure. It had meant the end of a version of his life that was, in the end, insufficient, not because the land was bad or the work was wrong or the cattle were poor, but because he had been living it as though self-sufficiency was the same thing as wholeness, and it was not. It had never been. The empty well had meant that the life he had been living was going to become the life he was supposed to live, and the bridge between those 2 lives was 3 barrels of water on a wagon driven by a woman who had not waited to be asked. He walked out and knelt beside her in the garden soil, and she looked up and the afternoon light was in her eyes and on her hands, and she said, "The apple will take 3 years to fruit." "That's fine," he said. "You're not thinking about the apple," she said. "No," he agreed. She sat back on her heels and looked at him with that full attention that he had come to understand was one of the finest things about her, the way she was genuinely present, genuinely with you, when she looked at you. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The summer before last," he said. "The well." She was quiet for a moment. "That was a bad summer," she said. "It was the best summer," he said. She looked at him with something moving in her face that was too full to name and also entirely clear. "You were insufferable for the first 3 days," she said. "I know it," he said. "You looked at those water barrels like they had personally offended you." "They had," he said. "They represented something I was not prepared to face." "Which was?" "That I needed something I could not provide for myself," he said. That someone had seen that before I admitted it and had come anyway and had not required me to ask for it. He paused. "Which is, I have come to understand, a very particular kind of grace." Birdie looked at him with those steady blue eyes and said nothing for a moment. James made a decisive sound in the grass beside them, having apparently reached a conclusion about the earthworm. Clara's whistle sounded from the porch, thin and wavering and triumphant. "I brought the water because it was the right thing to do," Birdie said finally. "That is all it was." "I know," Raymond said. "That is exactly the point." She reached out and put her hand against his jaw the way she sometimes did, that direct and simple gesture of contact that he had come to need the way he needed sound sleep and honest work. And he put his hand over hers, and they stayed like that for a moment in the spring garden with their children nearby, and the new trees waiting to root, and the land around them green and generous and entirely theirs. The months that followed accumulated into years with the satisfying density of a life that is genuinely and fully lived. The apple tree fruited in its 3rd year exactly as predicted and produced abundantly, and Clara was 12 by then and James was 6, and had achieved his sister's level of whistling proficiency and exceeded it, which was a source of great familial dispute settled finally by a judge, Ernesto, whose ruling that they were equally accomplished was accepted by neither party but sustained the peace. Ernesto himself had brought his mother permanently from the border country and built a proper house on the east edge of the Talbot land, and his mother kept a magnificent kitchen garden that was the object of polite but intense horticultural competition between herself and Birdie, which both women insisted was not competition at all, and which produced, in any given season, enough preserved food to supply a small army. Pete Larkin did marry eventually. A girl from Comfort named Hannah who had come to visit her cousin in Careville and had been brought to a church social by that cousin and had met Pete in the receiving line, and who had assessed him with the practical thoroughness that Raymond found oddly familiar. They settled on a small place 10 miles north, and Pete ran a few head of cattle and did contract work for Raymond during busy seasons. And he and Raymond had the kind of friendship that develops between men who have worked the same hard ground together and know what the other is made of. Hooper's fence was repaired every season as a matter of principle, and Hooper always had water for whoever needed it in dry years, and the spring-fed pond became an informal resource for several neighboring operations. A piece of informal cooperation that the county newspapers occasionally celebrated in the way county newspapers sometimes celebrated things that had simply been neighbors being decent to each other. Raymond built onto the house 3 times as the years passed. First, a second bedroom for when Clara needed her own space, then a proper study for Birdie's growing collection of agricultural texts and correspondence with the University Extension Office in Austin, then a wide covered porch on the south side that caught the evening light and became the center of a great deal of the family's domestic life. The place where decisions were made and stories were told, and arguments were conducted and resolved, and the long, easy silences of people who are genuinely at peace with each other were companionably occupied. Clara grew up with her mother's eyes and her mother's directness, and a gift for mathematics that surfaced around the time she was 8, and that Raymond quietly ensured was taken seriously. He drove her to town twice a week for lessons with a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Baum, and when Clara was 14, he wrote a letter to the county school board about the establishment of a proper school, and the letter was co-signed by 7 other ranching families and was effective. James grew up solid and deliberate, more like Raymond in temperament than Birdie, but with her generosity visible in the way he treated animals and the hired hands, and the steady stream of children who showed up at the Talbot place on any given Saturday, because it had become understood in the district that there were carvings to be had there if you asked, and stories, and the opportunity to learn to whistle from a boy who was exceptionally committed to passing on this skill. The peach trees were still there. All 8 of them, thick and established by the time James was old enough to climb them, which he did, with the single-mindedness of a boy who has identified a worthy challenge, bearing every year with the fidelity of things that have been properly tended. Birdie put up preserves from them every August, and the preserves went to the Schwartz store and to neighbors and to church suppers. And some years there were enough peaches that Raymond and Birdie sat on the south porch in the August evenings with a basket between them and ate them fresh, the juice running down their hands, and talked about nothing in particular with the ease of people who have been talking for a long time and have found that the talking itself is the point. One evening in late summer, when James was 7 and Clara was 12, and the heat was beginning to break at last toward the end of the day, Raymond sat on the south porch and watched the sun go down over the post oaks and the creek and the land. Their land, all of it together, the 420 acres of the old Talbot place, and the 160 of Birdie's homestead claim, merged now into a single coherent operation with a name above the gate. Talbot Ranch, and underneath it, in Birdie's careful hand on a piece of painted board, the words, "Established 1883. That was the year the well went dry. That was the year Birdie brought the water." She came out and sat beside him with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one and settled into her chair with the ease of a woman entirely at home in her place, and they watched the sky turn from gold to copper to the deep blue of a hill country evening. "You know what day this is?" Raymond said. Birdie thought for a moment. "August 3rd, she said. It was a Wednesday, I think." "I was standing at the well," he said, completely certain I had no options. "You had options," she said. "You just hadn't decided which ones were acceptable yet." "What made you come?" he said. He had never asked directly. He had thanked her many times in many ways, but he had never asked what had made her load those barrels on a wagon and drive them north to a neighbor who had given her no particular reason to be generous. Birdie held her coffee cup and looked at the darkening sky, and was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking carefully. "I had been watching your land for weeks," she said, "watching the dust and the dry creek and the cattle looking worse every day. And I knew your well was failing because I could see the signs of it." She paused, "and I thought about what it would take for you to come and ask me for help." "And," he said, "and I thought he won't," she said simply. "He is too proud and too certain that asking would mean something that it doesn't mean, and the cattle will die and the ranch will be in serious difficulty, and he will be sitting on the rubble of it before he asks." She looked at him. "So I thought, why should he have to ask? Why should the water sit in my well while his cattle die of thirst because nobody has done the sensible thing yet?" "You made it very easy for me," he said, which was generous. "I made it very easy for the cattle," she said. "You I made only moderately easy for," he laughed. "True." She looked at him with that expression that had all the history of 8 years in it, the fence-lined mornings and the peach trees and the supper table and the son asleep in the house behind them and the daughter reading by lamplight and the land around them breathing in the cooling night. "I did not bring the water because I was certain you deserved it," she said. "I brought it because it was the right thing and because I had noticed you, and I wanted to see what you would do when someone did the right thing for you." "And what did you find?" "I found," she said, "that you were capable of doing right by it, eventually." She reached over and put her hand on his, and his hand turned to hold hers the way it always did, with the natural completeness of things that have fit together long enough to know their own shape. Which was all I was looking for. The night came fully down over the hill country. The stars appeared one by one and then all at once, the way they always did here, thick and close and beyond counting. Inside the house, James made a small sleeping sound. Clara turned a page. The creek ran, full and steady and reliable, and the peach trees stood in the dark of the orchard with the dense patience of things that have been tended and have thrived. Raymond Talbot held his wife's hand on the porch of the home they had built together, and felt the particular peace of a man who has made his mistakes and found his way through them and arrived somewhere better than he deserved and exactly where he was supposed to be. He had been a proud man at an empty well, certain that the world's answer to his need was insufficient, certain that asking was too high a price, certain that the boundary between his land and everything beyond it was the boundary between himself and anything that could diminish him. He had been wrong about all of it. He had been wrong in the most instructive and irreversible way, wrong in a way that had led him, against his own resistance, to the best things he had ever known. The woman beside him had known that, or sensed it, or simply refused to let pride, his or hers or the kind that just happens between people who haven't yet learned each other, stand between a need and a solution. She had brought the water because it was there and it was needed, and because she was, at her core, a person who understood that boundaries between neighbors were never absolute, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply arrive with what someone else lacks and make it very easy for them to receive it. James woke early the next morning. He always did, and came out to the porch where Raymond was already up, watching the first light move across the land. He climbed into the chair beside his father with the focused intent of a boy who has identified the correct location and is settling into it, and he sat there for a while looking at the same landscape Raymond was looking at. "Tell me about the well," James said. It was the first time he had asked, though Raymond suspected he had heard the story around the edges of other conversations and had been waiting to hear it properly. "What do you know about it?" Raymond said. "That it went dry," James said. "And that Mama brought water." "That's the shape of it," Raymond said. "Your mother had a well that still had water in it and mine did not. And rather than wait for me to come and ask her, which, you should know, would have taken a good deal longer than was sensible, she loaded barrels onto her wagon and brought the water to me." James was quiet for a moment, looking at the land. "Were you embarrassed?" he said. "Considerably," Raymond said. "But then it got better." "Then it got better," Raymond said. "Then it got considerably better than better." The boy leaned against his father's arm with the comfortable weight of a child who is exactly where he means to be, and Raymond put his arm around him. And they watched the morning come in over the hill country, over the post oaks and the limestone outcrops, and the creek running full, and the orchard where the peach trees stood in the early light, green and generous and deeply rooted, proof that things tended with care and commitment could survive the worst the land could offer and come back stronger than before. Birdie appeared in the doorway with coffee and the particular expression of a woman who has seen something she is glad of, and she stood there a moment looking at her husband and her son in the morning light, and her expression settled into something that was not a smile exactly, but was what comes after happiness has been present long enough to be simply the quality of the air. "Come in and eat," she said. "Both of you." They came in. Clara was already at the table with a book. She was 13 now, and reading voraciously, especially anything to do with numbers and land, and the way the world fit together into systems. And James sat down beside her and immediately began a conversation about earthworms that Clara received with patient, brotherly directed love. Raymond sat across from Birdie, and she poured coffee and they ate breakfast in the warm light of the kitchen in the house on the hill country land that was entirely theirs. And outside the peach trees stood in the morning orchard and the creek ran clear, and the year stretched ahead of them green and full of promise. That was how it was. That was how it continued to be. The years that came were not without their difficulties, a bad market year that required careful management, a fever that came through in James's 9th year that frightened everyone, and from which he recovered fully, a prolonged disagreement with a county commissioner about grazing rights on common land that Birdie resolved by writing a series of letters of such unimpeachable logic that the commissioner ultimately conceded every point, and which became something of a legend in the district. Clara left for San Antonio at 18 to pursue her mathematical education, weeping only briefly at the gate before squaring her shoulders and climbing into the stage with the resolute composure of a woman who is ready for what comes next. She came back for every Christmas and wrote letters that filled the whole family with pride. But the difficulties were the difficulties of a life that was alive and moving, not the difficulties of defeat. They were managed and resolved and integrated into the ongoing, expanding story of what the Talbot land and the Talbot family were, something built carefully, from good materials, by people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing. On a September evening when Clara was 20 and James was 15, and the post oaks were beginning their autumn turn, and the light was golden and long over the hill country, Raymond and Birdie sat on the south porch as they had sat so many thousands of evenings, and the land spread out before them in the last of the day's warmth, and the creek murmured in its channel, and the peach trees still there, still bearing darkened in the shadow of the approaching evening. Raymond said, "Are you happy?" Birdie looked at him with those blue eyes that had not changed, still that same steady, clear, slightly amused attention that had first fixed on him across a fence line when he was standing at an empty well trying to refuse help he desperately needed. "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without qualification, with the simple and complete certainty of a woman who has built something real and knows it. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, and meant it in every direction, toward the land and the house and the children and the creek and the orchard and the years behind them and the years ahead, and most of all toward her, this woman who had arrived with 3 barrels of water on a hot August morning when his pride was running higher than his sense and his well was bone dry, and had changed everything without making a single word of it into more than it needed to be. She had simply come. She had brought what was needed. She had made it easy to receive. And from that single, unremarkable, generous act performed in the flat white heat of a drought summer, by a woman who had decided that the sensible thing was more important than the comfortable thing, from that, everything had grown. The evening deepened around them and the stars came out, and the Talbot land lay quiet and full under the wide Texas sky, and the two of them sat in the gentle dark, and let the peace of it settle over them the way the seasons always settled over this country, completely, without reservation, with a permanence that had been earned.